Well, I'm with Peter Minter, who was born in 1933 and whose family came to Bulmer, the Bulmer Brick and Tile Company, in 1936. And Peter has a wealth of memories about the brickyard and about Sudbury. So your boyhood memories, Peter, of arriving at Bulmer?
Well, the whole of the summer of 36 is fairly sort of memorable because we came down on a number of occasions. They were working on converting the house from just a single, quite a smallish house into a bigger abode by joining a dairy at the back into the actual house. So Father was working on the house and we came down on weekends and then finally came down about August of 1936 to actually move in. And it was still fairly crude because there was no running water at that stage. They bathed me in the kitchen sink, which was behind the kitchen door, so if you got the door shut you were sort of stuck behind there. But there was no lighting, it was the paraffin lamps and no electricity, no mains water. And the drainage was on the septic tank and remained so for many years. But it was country living, and I think Mother found it the biggest problem. As a child, it didn't bother me at all. And
you were actually on the telephone. I mean, most people weren't.
Yeah.
And your telephone number was
32.
Twinsted 32.
232.
Yes, you couldn't get much briefer.
No, and it was to the exchange at Twinsted, and before you could get through to get a line, you had to ring the exchange. You had a little box on the wall with a bell on, and you rang that frantically, and then someone would answer from the exchange and ask you what call you wanted, and they'd plug you in. And if it was sort of out of hours or odd times, they would say, "Oh, it's no good trying there. He's gone to so and so this evening," and they'd plug you through to the neighbours. So it was a much better system than we have today.
Yes, and so your dad took on the brickyard. And before very long, war broke out, and most kilns had to shut. Perhaps you could explain that.
Well, yes, we were only there from 36 to 39, and then war broke out. And all the kilns, and almost all of them throughout the country, were open-top kilns, updraft kilns, so the heat went in at the bottom and out and through the top. So when the top got hot, they were literally a rectangular of glowing light. And of course they were seen from the air. So every brick kiln in the country of that type was put out on the 3rd of September 1939. And one of ours was one of those.
Yes, and the bricks in it, did they stay?
Well, in our particular case, we were allowed to dome the kiln over with ports in the top of the kiln, so it took away most of the light and allowed to fire it to complete it. There were 35,000 bricks in there, so there was quite a lot of money.
Yes.
And another kiln was about to be lit, and that wasn't lit. And I think they domed that one, but they never did light it. Yeah. And the one that was fired was then machine gunned at night. So Father thought it better not to do so. He had just built a new kiln, and that was due to sort of come online about the end of 39. And in fact, I think he first fired it in 1940.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And one of your kilns was downdraft, so you could fire it throughout the war.
Yeah.
And I think this was producing things like drainage pipes for airfields.
Yeah, that's right.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, we built this kiln, a downdraft kiln. The difference in the technique is that the updraft, the heat goes in at the bottom and it goes up through the wares. A downdraft kiln, the heat is going in through what are called fireboxes up the side of the kiln, which channels the heat into the dome, and it's sucked by the chimney down through the bricks and out of the bottom. So it reverses the draft, which it doesn't. It's a domed kiln. It doesn't have anything open to the atmosphere, so you can't see it. The only place it could be seen is that when it got hot, the chimney would have glowed. The top of the chimney, you could see into it. So a sheet of metal was suspended above it, so you couldn't see directly into it. And it was allowed to be fired. It was one of the reasons we survived, because there were very few kilns like that in the country even. It was certainly not in this area. And our clay was the right clay, so we went over to making land drain pipes. And the War Ag Committee, which was the War Agriculture Committee, which was formed when war started to supervise farming not only were they looking to improve farming and get more yields, but they were also, some farms were taken over and run by the War Ag Committee because the farmers were not running them well enough. Yes. So there was a big drainage schemes went on, and we were part of that, and very quickly we became supplying the ministry for airfields, and of course they grew so quickly from sort of 1942 through to 44, well over 100 in East Anglia, and we supplied quite a lot of them.
I think, Peter, you remember supplying or going with your dad to Waldingfield, Chiltern Airfield,
yeah,
and supplying pipes.
Yeah, well, that was a late, I think it was built in 1943. It didn't start operating till 44. It might have started even a little earlier and then stopped, but it was a late airfield, really. And it was, the McAlpines were the main contractors, and my uncle's firm, F.G. Minter, were a subcontractor, and they were responsible for all the living accommodation and that side of it, while McAlpines were doing the runways. But we were supplying pipes. And Father, they didn't only come from here, they came in from Peterborough and places like that, and Father organised the rail transport into Melford Station. And from there they were taken by lorry onto the site.
Yeah. And you were a young lad at Bulmer Brickyard, surrounded by woods and fields and farms, and you began to earn your first pocket money by utilising the local rabbits.
Yes. Well, yeah, we had a chap called Fred Honeywood, a wonderful man, who was sort of a general labourer, but he lived in one of the cottages coming into the yard, and I used to spend a lot of time with him, and he was a really nice, gentle character. But he had the right, or Father gave him the permission, to ferret and to trap and snare rabbits and game on our land. There wasn't very much of it, 26 acres, but he was given that right. And I used to go around with him in the morning. He used to come to our house about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning and pump up the day's water, because we didn't have mains water. It all had to be pumped out of a well. We had an old pump, and he used to come in and pump that up first thing in the morning. And as soon as I heard the overflow going, I'd be out of bed and downstairs and with Fred, because when he'd finished that, he went round his snares, and you would see what you had caught the night before. So that was a great excitement to me. And later on, as I got a little bit more adult, I suppose, he gave me, or allowed me, to have a small part of my own land. and I was allowed to set snares on that particular area. It wasn't the best area, but I did catch things. Yeah. And I learned how to set snares, and I learned how to catch rats and rabbits and anything else that was going, really.
And years later, when you had left school and began your farming career, it was from the money you had saved up from...
Yeah, well, largely, because my grandmother, during the war, there was a drive for raising funds, and they had war saving certificates. And she was in the local, I don't know whether it was WVS or something like that, and she ran the local savings club. So you could go to see her and you could buy a savings certificate for 2 and 6pence, or I think that was the smallest denomination, 5 shillings, that was a big one. And you could buy these, and they were all recorded, and they had interest on them. So over the period of the war, in fact, they earned quite a bit of money. So I used to put all my savings into her savings certificates. And I think she used to top it up occasionally too, which was always a help. But we were getting 2 and 6pence for a rabbit. And that was a lot of money then, yes, because of the shortage of food. Yes. And Father used to bring the rabbits down to the market, or he used to bring them down to a butcher. He used to bring down the road here to Cook's Butchers and bring in a number of rabbits, and he would pay them. So I would get 2 and 6. And over the course of the war, it amounted to quite a bit of money.
Yes. And you talk about coming down here to Sudbury in the 1940s. Little memory, Peter, of the Market Hill, the steps, garages.
Yeah, well, I suppose the first real impression I had of the town, I mean, I remember the town, but something that was very vivid and is still vivid, was that the north side of the Market Hill, that's the boot side of the Market Hill, had 2 steps. It was 2 steps higher than the road. And although they were quite wide steps, it was quite a significant drop. And the pavement then restricted everybody to that area. And I think it's the Christmas before the war, so I think it would be Christmas 1938. And I came shopping with my mother and my grandmother, and we were on the pavement walking up towards Boots or somewhere in that area. And somehow, as a child of 5, of course it's so easy to get detached, and I got detached from them and had to go down the steps because all I was walking was a sea of legs. I could see very little. And I lost them and panicked because I wondered where they'd gone and what had happened. I knew that for some reason that they were going into a chemist's, and there were a number of chemists up the Market Hill. I can't remember the name of the first one, but the one at the far end where the shoe shop is now was Brampton's, and they were quite, Brampton's and the one I can't remember were similar shops, that they had a door at one end. You walked in, the counter was in front of you, it was a long counter the length of the shop, and you could walk out of the door the other end. So they were quite narrow and brightly lit, and so I remember going into the one and couldn't see anybody, and finally finding my way up the street and finding the other shop, and found mother and grandmother, great relief. But the brightness of the light in the shops was interesting because outside I think they still had gas lighting.
Yes.
And the lights were very low, actually to the pavement, and the light was quite a yellow glow. It was a sort of Dickensian, really, very a Dickensian feeling about the whole thing when I think about it now. But it stuck in my mind because it seemed to be so many people, and you couldn't see anywhere, and Christmas carols. The whole thing was a Christmassy atmosphere, and to me it was a hugely impressive.
And we were talking about the fact that traffic went round the Market Hill both ways,
yes,
and that there were garages. You could buy petrol.
Yes, there was well, it was actually a bike shop. It was Flack's cycle shop, and he had a shop which would be about where Specsavers are or somewhere there, and he used to sell bicycles and repair bicycles, and there were outside was bicycles and wheels and things hanging up. But he had a petrol pump which stood on the pavement next to the shop, and it was a pumped up shop. So you had a pumped up pump. You actually worked a handle backwards and forwards, and it would pump up a gallon of petrol into a tube, and you could see it coming up. And then you drew off that petrol. While you were doing that, you pumped up the second tube, so you could see the petrol coming in and doing that. And the delivery to the car, there was a pipe off the top of the pump, which was on a boom, and he'd swing this out over the pavement and spout down into the car.
So people would be walking
under the bed.
It's just wonderful that you could fill up your car with petrol on the Market Hill.
Oh yes, exactly.
Yes.
I remember the last time I did build the car when I left school. I came by a wreck of an Austin 7. It had gone under a lorry because it had a soft top, and it had chopped the top off, but it hadn't wrecked the bottom. And so father came by this, I think, and then I subsequently came by it, and I decided to build it into something better. Now, my skills were limited, and in those days there were no customs kits and things for cars, and it wasn't normal to do it. So I built a sort of wooden frame and covered it in tin. I couldn't really manage doors, so I had them sort of cutaways you could climb in rather than get in and out. And that had the petrol tank under the bonnet, so you could swing this across and lower it down and take your bonnet off and put your... and I think my bonnet was held on by 2 straps, rather like a racing it. And that was sort of, a bit with it, really. I was being...
The man about town.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it was a pretty useless car.
So by this time, Peter, you've left school, you've begun farming, and it's interesting that you could make a living as a farmer on relatively small amount of land, and that Sudbury at the time was surrounded by mixed farmers, as opposed to today when it's nearly all monoculture.
Absolutely. I mean, I look back at it and think it's interesting. Many people will know and remember Adrian Bell and his books on farming, and he had a farm out near Hundon. He started in the 1920s, I think, and just by sheer work and endeavour created a small farm and built it up into a larger one. I read his books. He'd written a number of books, and I was taken by the whole way he had achieved things on his own and how the whole thing had gone. So it was rather that philosophy which in some ways actually finally held me back. But on the other hand, it allowed me to develop in all sorts of different ways.
Yes.
And so the small amount of land, I gradually developed the land that we had and made that my sort of
Yes.
vocation.
Just to help me, Peter, I mean, this was 80, 90 acres or...
No, 26.
26 acres. And
Yeah.
from that, you had chickens and pigs.
Yeah,
Yes. And this was enough for you to start.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I got married on that.
yes.
I was earning £7 a week.
Well,
Well, it's about what my income was, put it that way.
yes. And you would bring the pigs down to Sudbury Livestock Market.
Yeah, yes.
And perhaps a few memories of the livestock market.
Well, the livestock market was a hub on a Thursday. I mean, it was the noise and the activity. It was hugely busy. Lorries coming in with cattle on board, all making a noise, of course being taken off, the pigs squealing. There was always plenty of pigs squealing, and chicken in crates, and they were all flapping about. It was a very busy place, and I subsequently, when I started to produce pigs and I had old chicken I was getting rid of, I used to use the market as my point of sale.
And this was just up Burkitt's Lane.
Burkitt's Lane, yes.
So
Just where the toilets are, basically, just up there, yeah.
It was within 50, 60 yards of the market.
Oh, yes, yeah. And the odd pig would get out and the odd cow would get out, and you'd see someone tearing down the market hill, swearing fairly volubly, trying to catch it. But people would always join in and stop it and drive it back.
Yes.
No one ever bothered. You didn't ignore it. You just got on and caught the pig or caught the whatever it was. It was quite normal.
And it was quite a social occasion for farmers. There was a pub opposite.
Oh yes, there was the Volunteer,
Right.
which was again rather like the chemist. It was not much bigger than this room really. It was a slot, very small, with 2 doors as far as I remember. It might not have had, I'm not sure about that, but it was very narrow, and the bar, and it was a job to get in. It was always full all market day, and that was a very social sort of place. I was not an outsider, I was local, but I wasn't a farmer. I wasn't from one of the farming families. I didn't know all the tricks of the trade. The established farmers had got a group. When they sent their cattle down, they depending on who they were and what they were, they got the best pens. If I sent anything down, it was in the pen at the back of the market, so that it was less likely to get a good bid. Generally, and the buyers were much the same because they were all the local butchers and people like that. So it was a little bit of a ring, if you like.
Yeah.
But I learnt that, and so I used to sort of find ways round it by trying to get my pigs down early and insisting they went in the first pen. I don't know that it made me any more money, but I did try.
Yeah. And you also took samples of corn to the Corn Exchange, now the library,
Yeah.
and there will come a point, Peter, where nobody will remember going to the Corn Exchange.
Yeah, I'm sure. In fact, very few people do now, actually.
No.
The first time I sold my first load of corn to Smith and Frost of Halstead, to Mr. Smith, who was a wonderful man and very helpful to me. And it was my first harvest. It was barley, and he bought that. And subsequently, I suppose I got a little bit more, or whatever reason, one particular year and soon after, I took it down to the Corn Exchange. Well, just going into the Corn Exchange was daunting. I mean, it really was. There was a mass of farmers all talking, all on the stands, all chatting away. Some of them looked at me and ignored me, others, but it was quite a daunting prospect. And
Just explain the stands, Peter.
well, they were a desk.
Right.
So they were quite a large desk, sloping desk, with a board on the front which would say who it was. It would be Askew's, it would be Unwin's, it would be Rawlinson's, it would be somebody, name on there. And then on the desk they would have sample bags of corn they'd bought, corn they'd rejected. They would have cutters, which were a circular disc with a series of holes in, and you put your corn in there, and then you actually close a knife across the top of it, which would cut the corn in half, or grain in half, and you could see whether it was steely, because if a barley is got too much nitrogen or it hasn't quite ripened, it has a hard centre kernel and very steely. You can tell it if you bite it as well. But this was a means of looking at a number of grains and seeing what a sample was like. And they'd do that and tip that out, and they'd put another handful in and do the same again and say, oh, that's, and they'd pay you on the quality of that sample.
And there was more than grain merchants there. There were people had stands if they were merchants of other things in the farming community.
Oh yes, certainly corn sacks.
Yes.
I mean, most corn was harvested in sacks, so it wasn't a combine. Even if a combine, they were baggers rather than bulk combines. So your corn was all in bags, and of course these sacks were not only expensive, but they were always a problem to get them. But they were on hire, and so firms like Askews and various people like that would hire them out, and you could hire so many bundles of sacks, and of course they were returnable after the harvest.
Peter, did you ever see any women on the corn exchange? My father said it was very, very unusual.
I don't remember that,
No.
but then I didn't go down every week.
Yes.
I only went down sort of 2 or 3 times in a year. I don't remember. The first desk to me, or not straight in front of me, but I walked in, was Rawlinson's from Halstead, or Headingham, that's where their mill was. And Mr. Rawlinson obviously saw me come in. I don't think he knew me at that stage, but he took sympathy on me and called me over. And we did our first deal. And I traded with Rawlinson's until they packed up and Peter, the son, unfortunately died. But we had a long established relationship, and that really came out of that first effort at going into the corn exchange.
Yeah. And about the time you were doing this, you were starting your farming career, you were also playing a key, enthusiastic role at Sudbury Rugby Club, one of your great loves.
Well, yes, I mean, I think the club restarted, I believe, in 1940. It was formed in 1925-26. And I think it went into abeyance over the war, and it restarted in 1948, I think. And Ray Emeny, who worked for Oliver's on the Market Hill, was a estate agent. He was keen, and a number of his friends, and they got together and reformed the club. And I think there were people like Jack Wheeler, the McQuays, a number of local people, a number of schoolmasters, a chap called Bond, who was a schoolmaster in Colchester Grammar. I can't remember the name of the chap at Headingham, but he was headmaster of Headingham School. He was a Welshman. He was a rugby player, as you might imagine. Jim Craig, who was a local farmer. Jim Anderson, who was a local farmer. Or Bill Anderson, rather. The Rich brothers, who were local dentist sons. They were both rugby players. So there was a collection of quite good players. And they got a side together, and I think they approached me, but I was still at school, and I couldn't play until 1950. When I left in 1950-51 was my first game.
Just tell everybody about the pitch that you played on, that you first played on.
Well, we played up at Chiltern, just near Chiltern Grange, on the corner, and it was a meadow, and they used to they had a dairy herd, and they also had bullocks. So if it wasn't the cows, it was the bullocks had been on the pitch, and it kept the grass very low and it kept it very lush. Unfortunately, it also had a few cowpats, so we used to go around if we could with a shovel and try to clean a few up, but invariably you didn't.
So before the game, you had to clear the cowpats.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's up to you really, but yes. I mean, if you had only cleared one half by the time it was kick-off, you won the toss, you always played the best half.
In those days, there was no clubhouse, and you changed in what used to be the Bear pub.
The Bear, yeah. The Bear, which was down at the bottom of the Market Hill there, or just below the hill. And that we had before the one-way system went in, there was a car park and a fairly large garage. And somehow, I don't know who arranged it, but it's through probably Jack Wheeler and someone like that, they managed to get permission from the brewery to turn this into a changing room, and we had showers in there and a very primitive changing room. But it was most effective, and it worked well. And the club room itself, we had a meal upstairs there after the match.
So it was still a functioning
pub. Oh yes, very much so. But we always had sausage and mash, and we were known far and wide for the quality of our teas, which most clubs didn't provide, but we always had salties and that.
I think the first time you went into the Bear, you were surprised to see somebody dancing on the
Oh,
bar.
yeah, well, the one door of the rear bar was onto the street. There's a wall there, you can't walk straight out, but in those days, of course, there was no road. But you just open that door and step down a step into this quite dingy room. And the first Saturday I was playing, I'm not even, in fact, I think it was a home match, and I have a feeling it might have been against Hollesley Bay. I seem to remember that, but it was the first home match and the first match I played. I arrived with all my kit, opened the door, stepped down into this room, a huge amount of noise and laughter and things going on, and on the bar there's a chap doing a dance, and he turned out to be the publican. And it was a young 17-year-old. These were all people who'd been in the war. They were all men, they were sort of 25s and 28s and 30s, you know, and to me this was another world, you know. I soon got the hang of it all, though.
I think there was an initiation ceremony up at the pitch that you played at Chiltern with the pond.
Yes, well, there was a pond in the corner as you came into the field. There was a horse pond, and if you were getting engaged or got married or something particularly happened, the first thing they do is throw you in the pond. It was best to go in after the game, at least sort of wash you, but if you went in first, you played the game dripping wet before you started.
Anyway, Peter, you then took a sort of very enthusiastic leading role in getting a proper rugby pitch for the rugby club and getting the clubhouse built.
Yes, well, 1950, would have left school in 50. I got called up for national service in 52 to 54, and I was stationed in London for the larger part of that. And we played some very good quality rugby. And I was playing against first-class sides. People like, in those days, Blackheath was a first-class side, Richmond was a first-class side. Now they've gone. People like that, Met Police was a hugely strong side. And so I was playing against quality people and current internationals. And I got a taste for it and really loved it. Unfortunately, before I came out, I got a severe leg injury, and so I had to stop playing relatively early. But I came back to Sudbury and wanted to see Sudbury move up, because we had good players, it just hadn't got organisation or desire, really.
And just the story of how the club moved to its own ground and established the first clubhouse.
Yeah, well, the whole thing, I got put on the committee fairly early on because I wasn't playing. I'd had to pack up playing when I got back, and so I sort of worked for the club, and I'd got friends there, and it was sort of, you know, my social life, if you like. And they decided they wanted to get their own club ground. And Ray Emily, being an auctioneer and estate agent, he knew the woman up at...
Mrs. Whittam.
Yes, that's it. Gertrude Whittam up at Cornard. And she was selling land off, and he wanted to know whether the club could buy a field that would be suitable for a rugby pitch. She was more than happy to let us have it. In fact, not only did she let us have it, but she said, well, you can pay for it when you can afford it. And that, of course, gave us the chance to get into it. And she became our benefactor, really. And in fact, there should still be at the club, and I don't know whether there is, a carved sign up to Gertrude Whittam, but to commemorate her. And that was the start of it. And that was now, that all's been built over, but that area was where we were. And we had enough for one full-size pitch and one slightly smaller size pitch. But that was the start of getting a ground.
Yes. And then the clubhouse, with changing rooms and things, was very largely built with voluntary labour and donations from businesses.
Well,
and things.
we first started off, decided, again, through Ray Emily, who was on the committee, and the committee generally decided that we would acquire second-hand bricks and building material, and when we could afford it, we'd start to build a clubhouse. And so plans were drawn up, and that's what they began to do. But it went on, and nothing ever happened, and stuff got pinched. And so the club decided they would sell all the second-hand material. So Father, having bought all the second-hand bricks for them in the first place, bought them all back again. So they're somewhere around Sudbury, but they're not at the rugby club. And then we decided that we could buy a pavilion, already made pavilion, which was actually, I don't know, it was a village hall or something like that type of thing in Cedarwood, that we as a club could erect ourselves. And that's what we did. My father organised the laying of the foundations and the concrete and setting it all out, and then the club members were going to build it. Well, the first summer we were very enthusiastic, and we got it 3 parts up but no roof on. The season comes along and no one wants to work, so we leave it, and then we had a storm and most of it blew down. So I think that I must have become chairman about that time. I decided, as I wasn't playing, I'd make it my job to re-erect this clubhouse, and so I dedicated, I got 1 or 2 volunteers, and we dedicated our Saturdays and other times as well to rebuilding the clubhouse. And we never did get it quite square. It was one end was beat us all the time, so the roof didn't sit very comfortably.
But from those days, Sudbury Rugby Club has just gone from strength to strength.
Oh yeah, yes. Yes, well, by that time I was refereeing a bit. I was on the Suffolk committee. I was on the Eastern Counties committee. I was on the London committee, and I got to know a lot of people. I also began to understand a bit about the way rugby was progressing. England were not doing very well. There was a big sort of movement to try to improve the rugby union. There was a report produced for the rugby union called the Malaby Report, which looked into the whole status of the game from grassroots up. And for some reason or other, I ended up on 3 Malaby committees around the country, and I learnt a lot about a possible structure and what could and couldn't be done. So I came back to Sudbury with a lot of knowledge, and I tried to make sure that Sudbury was always in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the way the game was progressing.
And it now has 4, if not 5 teams, women's teams, Colts teams.
Well, I don't think it has now at the moment, but it did. I think we ended up with 6 teams and a women's side and a Colts side.
Yeah, wonderful.
But it actually became, it was in the National Leagues for a short while, and it's dropped back, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. But they're doing a lot better again now.
Yeah. And all the while you were doing this, Peter, on a voluntary basis, you were, of course, progressively becoming more and more occupied with running the brickyard and enabling the brickyard to move with the times. And scores of local brickyards closed because they couldn't compete with mechanisation. And at Bulmer, you managed to find a niche market in making bricks for restoration. And
yeah, well, Father, after the war, killed most brickyards off. A lot of them had to close. A number came back into operation. All had difficulties at one reason or another, mainly because they wanted cheap bricks and they didn't want specialist bricks at all. The country was moving in a different direction. And he kept going. Because he was a builder, he started to do up cottages and properties around the area rather more than concentrate on his brick side. And what he used the brickyard labour on his building, but if he wanted a brick of a special size or something, he would make it himself. And so he started to go into, without thinking about it really, into a niche market. When he suffered ill health and my mother died and he died, and I was left with problems and a large family. What do I do? The brickyard was really on the edge of being closed, but because it was our base and our home, I decided I would try to save the brickyard.
This was about 1974.
Yes, 74 he died,
yes.
And 75, 76, I had a lot of luck. 75, a group of people from Avencroft Open Air Museum came to see me because they had just started this museum near Birmingham, where they were saving properties. In other words, if a timber frame building was being pulled down and destroyed, they were actually taking it down and rebuilding it on this site as an exhibit. And they built this open air museum there. And they were just getting this built, and they were going to run their first conference there. And they heard of me, I don't know how, came to see me and said, would I go and talk about brickyard? Well, I'd never done it before, and I went for 4 days. There were 8 speakers, I think, over the 4 days. I was just the junior, and I did my bit. But what I learned, they were talking about how buildings were built and what they were doing and how, all forgotten apparently, but I still did it. So I thought, well, this is the niche, this is where I want to be. So I started to look at the brickyard and try to build it back up again, and went for specialist work.
Yes, it is extraordinary, Peter. The brickyard was on the verge of closing, and you managed to save it, and it's the only brickyard making genuine handmade bricks in Essex and Suffolk, or in England. Or,
We're probably the most specialist yard in the country now,
yes.
and we've probably got a longer legacy of restoration work and techniques than anybody else now, because it's built up over a long period of time. And we bothered to learn about the buildings. I came back from Avencroft and I started to read the subject up. Any book I could read on architecture or history of architecture or history, anything like that, I read and developed the skills from that. And so suddenly we've got and still have a wealth of knowledge that is not in the public domain at all. And of course it's the foundation of what we do.
And I mean, 100 years ago, there were roughly 20 brickyards within a 10 or 12 mile radius of you.
Yeah.
And one of the things you've done is buy up and save moulds wherever possible.
Well, we did. I started to collect moulds up, particularly from Rippers at Headingham, who had particularly good moulds. I mean, they had a chap, I think, by the name of Gooch, who was their mould maker. And the Rippers at Headingham had some, and Mark Gentry before them, were the top of the range when it came to specialist making for the London market. And so we acquired eventually, in various ways, the moulds from there. I looked around from other works. I couldn't find the quality of works. It was interesting that Allen and Ballington's moulds, which the last of which were stored up at Wheeler's, I believe, there were not as good. Although Allen's were very, very good works, they hadn't got the same quality joiner, and the moulds were not as good. I've still got some of their moulds, but nothing like as good as Mark Gentry's. But I did collect them up. But then we've started to develop our own mould making, and over the years we've taken that to a different level again.
And just mention a few of the favourite restoration jobs that you've been involved in, out of the scores, if not
Well,
hundreds.
the biggest in terms of its effect generally is Hampton Court, because of the palace and its sort of persona and the whole thing of the palace itself. It led really the restoration conservation world, and they what they did there became an icon, and that has been followed by other things. So they really set the standard and the bar, and we've worked there now since 1975, and we're still working there. I don't know how many bricks there are, but there's an awful lot of our bricks in the palace now. So that was the biggest one, but we've done so many different jobs. I mean, locally we've done work, but just about not just about everywhere, but it's surprising. I mean, at the current time we're doing Restormel Castle down for the Duchy of Cornwall, we're doing Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland, we've just supplied to Adelaide in South Australia, we're supplying to Queensland, we've got an inquiry and work on in the West Indies, we're actually going to be selling some tiles to France. It's ludicrous, really. We do a lot of work in Norfolk, which is a lovely part of the world, where I always like working, but all over the country.
And St Pancras Station.
St Pancras Station, of course, was a huge one. Yeah. The biggest single job that in value that I've done. Yeah.
And about 10 years ago, you took on the challenge of building a new kiln.
Yes. Yeah.
Reflecting what your father had done 60 years earlier.
Yeah, he built this downdraft kiln between 1936 and 40, and I think it came on stream on 40. I had the drawings still. I used those drawings and we designed, or we didn't design, but we utilised those drawings to build the new kiln. I suppose it's about 15 years now.
It's an incredible achievement, and I mean, I always think, Peter, that you have preserved the craft and the heritage of all the brick-making industry that once centred around Sudbury and the Hedinghams. And I really mean that genuinely and passionately. And in addition to that, you are always very praiseworthy of the people who helped you, the Tom Birds, the kiln burners.
Well, yes.
And that's, you might like to say something about that.
I wrote some of that down. The reason being that if they hadn't imparted their knowledge, and they didn't teach me as such, but they involved me in doing everything. If I hadn't learnt from them, what I know now I would not have had. And secondly, all these skills would have gone. I wasn't doing something clever, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was a youngster and keen and enthusiastic. But this is what has happened. There was a moment when suddenly there's a click and I think, perhaps I should be looking at this seriously. And I've become much more involved.
Would you just like to sort of name some of the people, Peter?
Yeah, well, I mentioned Fred Honeywood, who lived in the house. Tom Bird, who came down to us in 1948. He was living up at the Hall at Wickham, or up in Wickham. He came and worked for us. We had Frank Surridge, who was a Gestingthorpe man and moved to Bulmer when he got married. He was one of the backbones of the whole business. Tom Rowe and the Rowe family. Philip Rowe, his brother, was there for a time. Jack Rash from Bulmer. And a whole host of other people who came and went, and Percy Rose, who was a chap. We had a wonderful carpenter called Harry Lee, who I'm always telling stories about, but he was a real character. And so there was a nucleus of skilled men.
And I think you have named your kilns after some of the old burners.
Yes, well, the wartime kiln, and Frank Surridge was the burner, and he largely kept that alive until when he left and Tom Bird took over. But we've called that one Frank, and the new kiln we called Tom.
That's a lovely thing. And was Harry Lee the person who had the experience on the Market Hill running over the policeman?
That's right. Yeah.
Do tell the story.
Well, he used to come down Friar Street, because in those days two-way traffic. So he came down Gainsborough Street and up the Market Hill to go round the church and off to Chiltern where he lived. And he had a moped thing. It was a bicycle with a wheel in the rear, a motor in the rear wheel, and it didn't really drive you along, but it assisted you. So Harry, coming back, would gain speed down Gainsborough Street, pedal furiously, and he would go up the Market Hill, which was quite steep, and then round the church. On this particular day, he'd just gone through his pedalling and started to go up the hill, and a policeman came out and put his hand up to stop him, and dear old Harry knocked him flat. The problem was, during the war, or before the war, the local police force all had helmets with a lot of regalia on. They were quite magnificent helmets, and rather like a fireman did. And this chap, we'd just gone back to sort of peacetime things, and for the first time this chap had got this helmet on. Harry knocked him down, and subsequently was taken to court, and the local court, and the magistrate said, "Mr. Lee," he said, a very serious thing, he said, "but can you speak for yourself and tell us what happened?" He said, "Well, yes, sir," he said, "I thought he was a bloody fireman." So dear old Harry didn't stop.
There's another story, Peter, you must tell. In addition to rugby, as a young man, you played cricket for Wycombe St Paul's, and you would sometimes be taken out on dear Bluffy Rippingale's coal lorry come bus, coming back up Ballington Hill.
Well, Bluffy Rippingale was a local character, came from Gestingthorpe. He owned little plots of land all around the country or the area. Wonderful character. And he ran a local bus service, and he also carted coal. And he had this bus which, he had a large barn in which you could drive the very small bus, I mean, and you could actually lift the whole of the bus part off the chassis and put a lorry back on, so you could cart coal for the rest of the week. But at weekends he used to put it back to a bus. And Wickham used to hire Bluffy's bus for the cricket tours when we played away, and places like Stanningfield we played, or Waldingfield or something like that. So this would mean that the team could just about get in this bus, and we would trundle off and play our game and then come back. And of course we had to go up Ballington Hill. Well, it wouldn't make Ballington Hill, so we all piled out, walked behind the bus pushing it and shouting at them, "Give it the welly, give it the welly." And old Bluffy would sit there, and we'd chonk up the hill about sort of 2 miles an hour, get to the top and all climb back on board again, and off we'd go. But so there are lots of stories like that.
Yes. And just before we end, Peter, you've been on Sudbury Museum Trust for many years, and you're currently the chairman. Any thoughts on where the Museum Trust has come from and how you might like to see it going?
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's the most important part of a town's sort of, facilities. There was a museum which was started by Barker, the mayor, way back, I must have been in the 60s. And he was very, very keen, and he got quite a lot of stuff together and formed a museum. It ended up making use of the railway station at Sudbury, which was then redundant, and we had rooms there, and the displays were there, and I think it was quite successful. I didn't do much, I went occasionally, but they asked me at some point whether I would put in an exhibit on bricks for some thing they were doing. Your father, he was the man, he asked me whether I would do it, and I did, and apparently it was successful. And he came back to me and said, "Oh, we would like to ask you to join the museum trustees. Would you be prepared?" So I did, and I've been there ever since. When the fire came and the museum got broken up, everything got scattered, and to cut it sort of story short, it defunct, and people drifted away and were left. Phyllis Felton was one of the local people who stayed in touch and was there. But after many, many years, for various reasons, I was able to resuscitate. I became chairman and treasurer by default, really. And so that was what we did. And when we reformed, we had the opportunity of getting our displays in the town hall, and with the assistance of the town council, we built up a nice little museum there. And I think it's now become very specialised because we had to have a change of policy. We couldn't hold everything. We had to make it very specific, and that's been one of its successes. We've gone for high quality, and we've gone for new ideas, for display, and I think it's now really has a place in the town, and the people who work on, all volunteers, are all part of that ethos. Where it goes now, we need to expand. I'm not sure quite how and where we're going to do that, but I do see it having to grow, and I think it will grow, as long as we don't try to become too ambitious, and while we do things that we can cope with. That's been the way I've run it, but I'm still at the moment chairman until they decide they don't want me any longer.
Well, I mean, Peter, it's been lovely to talk to you. Any final thought or memory or anecdote before we wind up? Or?
I don't know really. I could go on. I've said to you in the past, you don't really want me on an interview because I'd be here for days. But I think now I'm aware that we've saved the brickyard. We didn't set out to save the brickyard for that reason. It was about living and survival, personal survival. Now we've understood that, and now we've got suddenly becomes some sort of national business, or have an identity. I think we're looking to try to preserve that, record that, so that whatever goes on, that place is, the brick industry, and Bulmer in particular, sort of secures its place.
Yes. Well, Peter, I personally think you have contributed a most enormous amount, not just to the saving of the brickyard and of the brick industry and all of its heritage, but locally in terms of the rugby club and the museum. So thank you very much for coming and talking to us, and may the brickyard long continue.
Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you. Well, it's not been done from, personally. You just, in life, you get into things and do them. You don't necessarily think of the consequences, but I am glad it seems to work to some degree, and thank you very much for being gracious. Thank you.